and welcome to the podcast. This is Dan Lollick. As always, this is Evergrow Podcast. This is going to be the now first episode that I'm going to do. Basically, we're going to talk about probably the most prolific band I can think to talk about, which is Def Leppard. That's right, Def Leppard. Pour a little sugar on me. No, I'm just kidding. Talk about a band that's probably one of the more well-known bands in history. Most people would know them to hear them, and everybody knows who they are. But who are they really? Where did they come from? Where did it start? Of course, I'm talking about the Beatles. Now, for those of you who don't know who the Beatles are a band that started in the 1960s. Very, very popular, not only in the UK themselves, but in the US, New Zealand, especially Germany. They played there for a long time. And we're going to dive into a lot of who the Beatles are, where they came from, what they are all about. Well, to start from the beginning and to really figure out who the Beatles are, where they came from, and what really happened with their popularity, you always have to start with John Lennon. So John Lennon, for those of you who don't know, was born in England in around the 1940s. He was born into kind of a rough household. His dad was a seaman. He was seaman. He was off working, doing whatever, and not really around for the very beginning of John's life. John himself had to deal with his mum, and his mum wasn't really in the picture as much as she maybe should have been. She wasn't really as involved as she could have been. Now, that's not to say that John's mum is terrible or that she just couldn't handle dealing with John. But luckily for John and his mum, her family was able to help out. You know, they'd help take care of John and raise him through most of his adolescence and into his teenage years. Now, that being said, when John himself was growing up, his mum wasn't really around so much. She stayed with a lot of other people, his aunt, his uncle, which would be Mimi and George Smith. They didn't really have any children. They tried to do their best to kind of raise him and do what they could. You know, it was only when John's mum really lent him a guitar, and if I remember correctly, she lent it to him for a price. It was 5 pence and 10 shillings. But the point was that if he was to return the guitar, he was supposed to return it to her specifically. I would assume a lot of this had to do with the fact that just maybe John would spend some time with his mum, and she didn't want him giving this guitar back to his aunt, who really didn't believe in a music career. She thought music was a dead end, and that John should really focus on being in school and getting a proper education. Although by this time now John's a teenager and he's having problems in school. He's known as a class clown, he's causing problems, and there's a really funny story where he's taking part in an art class. They're doing a nude drawing, and he goes and sits on the lap of the nude, the model. And that itself is just hilarious, thinking about how comical and witty John actually was. I mean, later on we'll find out that he seems and appears very serious and artistic, but he's got quite the humorous side to him. Now, John went and started a band when he was in his teenage years. About 1956, he created a band called the Quarrymen. Now, the Quarrymen played together. They played it's not really rock and roll. It's known as skiffle. I'm really unsure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's kind of like more folky than being rock music. And him and his band would play Excuse me. And during this time, I think about the second performance that the Quarrymen now had. He meets this guy by the name of Paul McCartney. Now, Paul McCartney was auditioning to be in the band. John and Paul had talks and got to know each other a little bit, and John was very, I guess you could say, moved by Paul McCartney and was interested enough to have him as part of the band. And now with Paul McCartney as part of this band that was going to now become the Beatles, Paul McCartney then would suggest to John Lennon to let George Harrison audition to be in the band. Now, George Harrison, at the time when he joined the Beatles, was, around 14 years old. And Lennon really didn't have much interest in it, what he, perceived as this young kid joining the band. But he was willing to at least give Harrison an audition. And when Harrison auditioned, he played a version of Raunchy for Lennon, and Lennon loved it so much that he offered for George Harrison to now join this band with, and after George Harrison joined, then Stuart Sutcliffe was also introduced into the band. So now you have 4 members. You have Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, Stuart Sutcliffe. These guys were now this group called the Beatles, and they were going to start a residency within Germany. Now, this is in the early 1960s. But before they went to Germany, they really were in desperate need of a drummer. So they went out and they got Pete Best. Now, Pete Best was the drummer for the Beatles from 1960 to about 1962, which was a majority of those touring years and such with the band. The Beatles would then go from there to doing this touring spree in Hamburg, Germany. And from my understanding, the conditions that they were playing in weren't exactly the most favorable. They were on a lot of caffeine type-ish drugs just to keep energy going enough so that they could keep performing and keep fulfilling what they needed to do. And the living conditions weren't even that well either, because from different sources it says that they were forced in this situation where now they're having to wash and shave from toilet bowl water. There's actually a really amazing documentary that Ron Howard did just last year called 8 Days a Week, which is strictly kind of about those touring days for the Beatles before they kind of really hit mainstream popularity and just kind of what they went through. It was, Ron Howard made it, and it's kind of co-produced by the Beatles themselves. So first-hand accounts and so forth. Really wonderful documentary. If you happen to get a chance to watch it, I suggest you do. It's really, really good at understanding where the Beatles came from before they were this hugely popular band and Beatlemania kicked in. And it's during this residency in Hamburg that, the Beatles themselves really start developing into what everyone now knows them as. This is when they get their manager, Brian Epstein, who would have been their manager until his death in about 1967. And it's also about the time where Sutcliffe decides to stay in Hamburg. He wants to pursue his art career. And where they replace the drummer, Best, with Ringo Starr. So now you've got this 4-piece lineup of Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and George Harrison that will survive as the Beatles until they break up in 1970. Now, after this residency in Hamburg, the band themselves, they're going to release their first single, which is Love Me Do. It was released in October of 1962 and reached number 17 on the British charts. The album that would accompany that single, Please Please Me, was recorded in under 10 hours on February 11th in 1963. And John Lennon at that time was suffering from a terrible cold, and it was evident. If you listen to the song Twist and Shout, you can actually hear, almost like how I am right now, that he's congested and raspy, right? I mean, I'm raspy just because I got some sort of weird cold that's going on, and it's attacking everything when I decide to record. So it's like, I was doing fine, started my day. Now I'm just like, oh, I can't believe I need cold medicine. But that being aside, we will trudge on. And now really, this is the point where Beatles, they're now going to start getting success. They've got singles out. They have an album. They start playing various shows and stuff. And this is when Beatlemania now is beginning. There's a really funny story where they play a royal variety show, and John Lennon pokes fun at the audience, and he's like, well, for you guys in those cheaper seats up there, just clap your hands along with this song. And for the rest of you, just rattle your jewelry. No problem. And I think it's really funny that John Lennon has that kind of dry humor. It's really hilarious. And now, the Beatles themselves are really popular in the UK. They begin bringing out album after album. Almost every year these guys had brought out an album. And in February of 1964, they now go to the US and they play on the Ed Sullivan Show. And this now starts this international stardom of where not only are the Beatles now famous in the UK and popular in the UK, but now they've branched out into the United States and are now gaining popularity there. Now, it's really at this time that the Beatles kind of hit their stride. John Lennon and Paul McCartney are going to be the songwriters for a majority of the Beatles songs for the entirety of their careers. The Beatles themselves, in their career, in the 8 years or so that they were abandoned, like including those 4 people and making songs, touring, all that stuff, they made 12 studio albums, 13 EPs, and 22 singles in 8 years. That's a lot of music. And I mean, most of those songs hold up very, very well today. There's not many of those that people either don't know, don't love, or don't own several copies of. There's the Beatles themselves have a lot of history and stories, and one of those I'm going to share with you right now. There's a story about the Beatles in an Asian leg of their tour. They went to Tokyo, and then from Tokyo they were going to go to the Philippines. And upon arriving at the Philippines, they, were ushered to their hotel and went to bed for the night. They woke up in the morning to a banging on the door. And this person telling them, "Oh, well, you're running late. You're supposed to be at the Queen's gala where you're going to play." And the Beatles declined, and I mean, not rudely. They didn't go out of their way to be brash or angry, or they just politely declined. They're like, "No, we never really discussed playing for this Queen or whatever. We're just going to, we're doing our shows and leaving." And the uproar that came from that was so big of a backlash. I read an article about it not that long ago where it was discussing how, the Beatles had gone and declined this invitation. And they were instantly vilified in the Philippines. These people, for the entire rest of their stay in the Philippines was just horror after horror after horror. They wouldn't bring them room service. They were required to, move all their equipment, bags, and stuff all by themselves. You're talking the Beatles, their managers, the the roadies, and so forth and so on. And they when they went to leave, they got grifted for they had to pay a tax for playing there, and that tax that they had to pay was actually more than they earned playing there. So they actually came into the Philippines, did their concert, and actually had to pay the Philippines more money than they earned. And on the way out of the Philippines, they just ran into problem after problem. They got to the airport, and they shut the escalator down so that so that they would have to walk up the stairs and carry all their stuff. They had militia there who was, kicking and punching and beating up members of the band, the managers, the roadies themselves. Some of these guys suffering, cracked ribs. If I remember correctly, Epstein got kicked in the groin, and I mean, this just terrible endeavor that they go through while they go to the Philippines was so bad that when they left, they said to everyone, they're like, we are never going back there. Lennon's quoted as saying, the only time I'd go back there is to drop an H-bomb on them. I won't even fly over their country. And the Beatles had to deal with a lot of that. But anyways, that's kind of a sidetracked story. Back to what the real point is. What I was talking about was that now the Beatles have gotten into mainstream success. They're now popular in the States, and they're popular in the UK. In 1965, they're going to get some recognition from the Queen. They're going to become members of the Order of the British Empire. I think it was that was in 1965, and it was for the Queen's birthday's honors. And the Beatles now at this point have been recording and making albums for 3 years. They've released With the Beatles, Introducing the Beatles, Twist and Shout, their second album, Hard Day's Night. And the Beatles themselves are now getting this popularity that's almost so big that it even begins to get to, some of their hits. And this is kind of really at the point where by the end of 1965 is when, Lennon makes that super famous comment that everybody knows, where he's like, Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. We are more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. And I mean, that comment from Lennon was, in the UK, it wasn't as impactful, but in the United States, it was such a strong thing for an artist to say that it really had such a hard backlash. And because of that backlash, there were threats to Lennon, and people really started disliking the band, considering them evil or satanic or really not what they wanted their kids listening to. And this is kind of when the band themselves really stopped touring. They made the decision to back away from touring so much and really get into recording more. Just staying in the studio and writing new songs. And so for the latter parts of the 1960s, really mid 1966, all the way up until they broke up in 1970, the band would now just record a lot more than they would tour. John Lennon himself is now at a point where he's beginning to experiment more with drugs. There's a famous story about that where John Lennon is at a party. It's a party for some doctor, and the doctor spikes everyone's tea with LSD. And when the party members go to leave, he now informs them, well, you can't leave because you're on LSD. And John kind of obviously liked the effects the drug had, so he started playing around with it more. Now, that really is right around the time when John Lennon's he's starting to lose this interest in the Beatles. He's not as attached as he used to be to this idea that Paul and George and Ringo are all going to do this almost bubblegum poppy type band that he considered forever. He wanted to be more artistic. He wanted to be more rough and raw and rock and roll. And because, I mean, as much as the Beatles were rock and roll, because they were so mainstream and popular with young girls, they also were so much pop music as well. And it's really hard when you're an artist and you're trying to define your artistic soul to really differentiate between something that you consider almost shallow and poppy and this product that you're giving to an audience that means nothing to you. You're just doing it for money or whatever, to this grungy rock and roll soul that has all these songs that are so deep and meaningful. And for them, it's really, when they're writing these albums in the late 1960s, Strawberry Fields Forever, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, these kind of albums, to me, being a person who's listened to almost everything the Beatles have written, you can really feel John and Paul's artistic side when they're writing these, like where their heads at, what things they're really kind of in their minds and hearts. And I mean, my personal opinion, and nobody really has to share this, is that this is when the Beatles, for me, wrote their best music. This is when they would then record Abbey Road, A Yellow Submarine. A lot of these things are really pivotal to who the Beatles really were. I mean, yeah, they got a lot of their popularity in the early 1960s for these songs that, they wrote, they sang, and were instantly popular. But John Lennon himself wasn't really happy with the product that was being released. But now with these studio albums that they're making, now they're, Revolver and Rubber Soul had already been out, but Revolver and Sgt. Pepper and Yellow Submarine and Abbey Road, these are now catalysts for John Lennon to express this ambition that he has. And that's really kind of important to where the story goes from there. Now this is where John Lennon himself, he's going to start exploring his own life more. This for me is where John Lennon, because of LSD, because of the exploration of his musical soul, he's now going to start branching out. This is now where John Lennon is becoming an activist against the war. He's, really getting involved in Eastern religion. The Beatles, traveled to Maharishi's ashram in India, and that's where they composed most of the songs for the Beatles and Abbey Road. He was part of an anti-war black comedy about how I won the war. This is, for John, a very pivotal point in his life. He's soon going to meet Yoko Ono, and Yoko Ono is going to play a role in the finalization of the Beatles ending as a band. Now, there's a lot of people who will go and they'll blame Yoko for being the reason why the Beatles broke up. But I mean, really, if you really stop and look at it, these later years in the Beatles, they're generally, for Paul and for George and especially for John are are hard fought. These guys now want to get away from this almost like cookie cutter that's telling them that they're the Beatles, and they want to be John. They want to be Paul. They want to make their own music. They want to be recognized for their own contributions, which isn't exactly a bad thing. I mean, there's been plenty of bands that have broken up over the years that the lead artist has then taken their own solo careers. Sometimes even the band members themselves. If you look at the Foo Fighters, David Grohl, would leave Nirvana and go on to have an amazing career on his own. He'd appear in Tenacious D's movies, and he created the Foo Fighters. But I mean, we're not talking about David Grohl. Although I can really appreciate David Grohl, the discussion here is about the Beatles and how they're trying to find themselves on a personal level. Now, right around this time is when, Epstein is now deceased. He's died, and the band's without a manager, and they're branching out in different ways. They're trying to either find new management. John would eventually end up with Alan Klein, who managed the Rolling Stones and other bands that kind of came through during that British invasion that would happen. And Klein wanted to sign all these guys. And Lennon and Starr and Harrison are all kind of on board. Paul McCartney, not so much. I think for Paul, he kind of was realizing that the Beatles, this group, and wherever their endeavors were going to go, he wanted to have some control on what was going to happen in the future. Because he knew the Beatles weren't going to be forever. They weren't going to survive everything that was happening and be this super group that was untouchable. They were going to end up doing other things, and he didn't want to be almost confined by what was happening with the band and around them, which is completely understandable. And it's at this point that now John Lennon himself has become so kind of involved in so many various different aspects of these things that he wants, that for John, he's now at a point in his life where he's a really strong activist against the Vietnam War. I mean, Give Peace a Chance was almost adopted as this anthem for the Vietnam War. And to kind of pull back and to stop it. I mean, for him, he's seen so much of this chaos caused by the Vietnam War, which, I mean, on a side note, to me makes the movie Across the Universe, if none of you have seen this movie Across the Universe, I'll give you just a super quick synopsis of it. Across the Universe is a movie that's based about a gentleman and his friend's girlfriend and their life through the war and kind of what goes on. But it's a musical. It's based off of Beatles songs. So there isn't really any dialogue outside of Beatles songs, but it really portrays this view of the Vietnam War and these people's lives and what's happening to them both within the United States and abroad. Probably one of my favorite movies of all time. It is absolutely amazing. Of course, being a Beatles soundtrack is absolutely amazing, and the way that the movie flows and sucks you in the story, really good. If you haven't seen Across the Universe, I suggest you take the time to watch it. You will not be sorry for watching it. But anyways, back to John. John is so much of an activist against this war that, he even goes so far as to attempt to give his his Member of the Order of the British Empire medal back to the Queen in some sort of, show that he wants to be denounced as part of this, because they're, and I mean, you really can't do that, but I mean, it was more for the show than anything else. But I mean, this is now, because of all these things going on, is why right around the end of the 1960s and the end of 1969 is when John Lennon and the Beatles now break up. There's a story about how John Lennon's actually in Disney World when they break up. And, he's on the phone talking, and they've decided, okay, this is going to be the end of the Beatles as we know it. And he, hangs up the phone, and he's looking out the window, and he's kind of in this paused daze where he's almost contemplating or reliving the Beatles' history within his own mind. And he picks up a pad of paper, and he just signs his name at the bottom of the pad, puts it down. And for that moment, that was when the Beatles were collapsed. From then on, from the 1970s on, is now when the Beatles are no longer the Beatles. They're now Paul McCartney making his own music, John Lennon making his own music, George Harrison making his own music, and even Ringo Starr. I mean, as little as Ringo Starr gets talked about, he's still also very involved in music too. And there's a lot of stuff that gets kind of lost in the wash there. So that's kind of it for, a brief history of what makes the Beatles the Beatles. There's going to be a second episode to come out I'm going to touch on what happened after the Beatles broke up, where they went, what then happened to each of the band members in their careers to this point. And the other thing I want to touch on really quick before this whole Beatles thing ends is that if you ever get the chance, there's this almost confusing conspiracy theory regarding Paul McCartney, and it's called the Paul is Dead conspiracy. There's actually a really well-written article from Time magazine which kind of touches on this idea that Paul McCartney in the 60s got in a car accident and died, and that the Beatles replaced Paul McCartney with a body double, and that body double would then assume Paul McCartney's identity and continue the career, as to keep the band together and not have them break up and have to either recreate a band or just end the Beatles altogether. And because of that, it's a very interesting perspective. I mean, I can definitely, as an analytical mind, understand both sides. I could see why some people would consider that Paul McCartney died in a car accident, that they had covered it up, and that they replaced him with someone else who would then be known as Paul McCartney. But in my personal opinion, it's hokum. It's grasping at straws. Paul McCartney is Paul McCartney, and but it very much is an interesting read. So if you ever feel the interest in just reading something that's kind of deep and interesting, you might want to take a look at checking out the whole Paul is Dead conspiracy. It's pretty interesting if you ask me. But anyways, that just about wraps it up for the podcast. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen. As always, if you have feedback, or I made some grandiose error in my podcast and was totally off base with something, or you have an artist you'd like to hear me talk about and go through their history and explain to other people because you want to share that artist, I can always be reached at evergrowpodcast@hotmail.com. There's also a Facebook page which you can go on. And I look forward to coming back again, talk to you guys in about a week, and finishing up talking about the Beatles and seeing where all those artists went and how that whole story plays out. Look forward to recording more and more for you guys. I'm hoping to get 2 a week going. That would be nice. Kind of starting out a little slow. I'm still kind of new to this stuff. But, it's fun. I enjoy it. So have a great, wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.